where we will be taking the comments and recording them. And then we will move into the formal hearing process. The process to update this rule has taken about 4 years, and there have been several opportunities along the way to provide comments, to participate. So while we've made many, many changes to this rule, we're going to focus our presentation on the topics we've heard the most questions about. Then during the question and answer session, after the presentation, you can ask questions on what we presented about, or you can ask questions about anything else in the rule that you might need information on. Our presenters today are Dawn Marie Maurer, up in the Northwest Regional Office, talking about the determination of solid waste, recycling, and material recovery, and touching on inert waste. Marnie Solheim will discuss soils with us. Al Salvi will let us know about piles. And Megan Moorfield will talk with us about the changes to the rule in regards to moderate risk waste. In addition to these fine folks, we have a team of people to help us answer questions when the time comes. And during that time, when questions are for them, I'll introduce them. With that, Northwest, we will. How do I do it? Hold on just a second. We're going to pass it on to Dawn Marie. We need to unmute her. Dawn Marie? Do I need to do it? Nope, there it is. Okay, Dawn Marie, Northwest Regional Office. See if we can hear you. We can't hear you just yet, so hold tight. Just one moment, please. Very quick. Dawn Marie, can you unmute yourself on the phone? I hear somebody. Nope, that's not Dawn Marie. Well, I will go ahead and I have her script, so I'll go ahead and follow us through the presentation. We'll just keep going. It's fine.
Okay. Andy, can you hear me now?
Yes, we can hear Dawn Marie. Yay.
Okay.
Go ahead, Dawn Marie. Thank you.
Thank you, Andy. The determination of solid waste is a new section of the rule. It sets criteria for determining whether a material is a waste. This clarifies who is regulated by the rule. Essentially, this section acts as a tool. Anyone can walk through the determination to see if their material qualifies as a waste, or if it was a waste, if it's been recycled into a product or commodity or salvaged for reuse. Materials that fall out are not or are no longer regulated as a waste. Here are the key points to take away from the determination of solid waste. A material is a waste if it's discarded, picked up by a garbage hauler, sent to a regulated solid waste disposal or recycling facility, or does not have market value and generators have to pay to have it removed. Under this new section, a material is no longer a solid waste if it is salvaged to use as is, or has been made into a legitimate product or commodity, and has positive market value, and is managed as a valuable product to keep it from degrading. A few materials like compost already have standards in other sections of the rule for when they are no longer waste. The determination ties in with two key definitions, recycling and commodity. We changed the definition of recycling to clarify that it does not exclude activities associated with material recovery and that it includes producing commodities. We then added a definition of commodity which should capture sorted waste like baled cardboard, which have not yet been transformed into new products, but have clear quality standards and market value. I'll give you a couple of examples. Using the proposed criteria to determine if a material is a solid waste, When cardboard is dropped into a dumpster to go to a material recovery facility, it's a recyclable waste. When cardboard has been sorted and baled using a published industry spec, and the bale has value on the market, and the bale is stored to protect its value, it's no longer a waste. Here's another example. When metal is dropped off at a transfer station recycling bin, it's a waste. When metal is purchased by a scrap dealer who sells it to a steel forge, it never becomes a waste. These changes tie into the recycling and material recovery facility standards. Under the current rule, stakeholders were often confused which standards applied to their facilities, and sometimes both standards applied. With the change to the definition of recycling to include making commodities, more material recovery facilities will also be recycling. Because of this, we combined and aligned the standards for these types of handling under one section. Additionally, we changed the criteria for exemption to exclude most commingled facilities. This addresses the need for permit oversight at complex facilities. We anticipate that the determination tool and changes to the definition will create greater consistency across the state as to what materials are regulated as waste and what are not. Most material recovery facilities will still be handling some solid waste. Many facilities will produce some commodities, but not all processed materials are going to meet the type definition of commodity. Also, some facilities that are currently considered recyclers or material recovery facilities will no longer be handling solid waste because they'll only be buying materials off the market. Finally, we've built in ways to identify when handling activities are sham recycling or speculative accumulation in the determination of solid waste. So most facilities, both recycling and material recovery that are currently exempt will probably remain exempt. Exemptions cover individual streams like glass, wood waste, or carpet. Exemptions also cover commingled concrete, brick, and asphalt together. Other facilities handling commingled materials under an exemption will either have to change their operations or get a permit. However, many commingled facilities are already under permit. Some currently exempt facilities will fall out of regulatory oversight under the determination of solid waste, and some facilities that meet exemption criteria under 210 may also be storing materials outdoors in piles, and that may trigger permitting under those standards. The final change to the rule that I'll discuss is the proposal to remove Section 990, the criteria for inert waste. This decision came from the Stakeholder Rule Revision Work Group. After reviewing the criteria, the group decided to rely on the listed inert waste in statute and eliminate the section. The criteria were primarily used to assess soils, and the new definitions of clean and contaminated soil, which Marnie will talk about in a minute, now give another pathway for soil. Also, the most common listed waste, concrete, asphalt, and brick, still have exemptions under other handling standards. And I'll now pass the presentation on to Marnie to talk about soils.
Thank you. Can you all hear me?
Yes.
All right, thank you very much. So as Dawn Marie stated, I'll share changes to definitions in the rule as they relate to clean and contaminated soil and dredge materials. Currently, the rule applies clearly to only contaminated soils coming from cleanup sites and dangerous waste facilities. It is not clear how the rule applies to contaminated soil coming from other locations or how a person must manage such soils. This lack of clarity has led to agencies making case-by-case decisions on where these other soils can go, relying on guidance documents for uses, which can make enforcement challenging, and statewide inconsistencies for how materials get managed. In some cases, industry has set its own standards, putting them in the position of using materials in ways potentially harmful to humans and the environment. Regarding contaminated dredge materials, the rule has standards for upland disposal based on meeting contaminant concentrations for open water disposal, which may not be safe for upland locations. To address these issues, we propose changing definitions for clean and contaminated soil and dredge materials to make it clear that the rule will apply to all soils and dredge materials impacted by release of a contaminant and that will be moved from one location to another. The rule will allow the use of soil or dredge material containing contaminants at any location as long as the concentration of contaminants would not exceed a state cleanup level for those locations under the Model Toxics Control Act, commonly referred to as MOTCA. The rule also sets a pH standard for releases that affect the pH of materials. Uses that will not meet MOTCA or pH standards are subject to solid waste regulation and permitting, such as for limited purpose landfills or treatment in piles. The proposed rule will not apply to soil or dredge material that is dangerous waste, soil that doesn't move to another location, such as when temporarily removed and later put back in the same spot, management of materials within a cleanup site, dredge material placed back into or adjacent to water, and it will also not apply to reuse of engineered soils at a different site for the same engineering properties, and undisturbed soil or dredge material not proposed for excavation or removal. If you have questions on changes to this part of the rule, please keep them in mind to ask after the presentation. I'll now pass it on to Elle Salvi, who will tell us about changes to the pile section of the rule, Section 320.
Okay, thanks, Marnie. Can everybody out there hear me okay? All right, we'll get moving here. Thanks again, Marnie. Section 320 of this rule addresses solid waste stored or treated in piles. The current rule sets specific time frames for how long a solid waste of some type may be stored or treated in a pile before it requires a permit. For example, putrescible waste piles, or stuff that smells kind of bad, that does not contain municipal solid waste, such as this pile of wallboard in the picture. If it's in place at a site for more than 3 weeks, it would require a permit. The problem is that sites started removing and then starting a new pile with the same material before the 3 weeks time limit came up, and thus avoided permitting. So we propose making the piles requirements applicable to those facilities who continually have outdoor piles. Current throughput requirements for exemptions call for at least 50% of the material stored in a pile to be used within a year and all the material to be used within 3 years. Current exemption requirements do not require annual reporting. That makes determining if this requirement is being met very difficult to ascertain. The proposed draft rule now requires exempt facilities handling wood waste, wood-derived fuel, and non-ferrous metals to remove at least 50% of the sum of all the waste present at the start of the calendar year, plus the volume of all the waste accepted during that calendar year. Annual reporting is also going to be required and can be used to help verify whether or not this requirement is being met. This should help prevent large piles from accumulating on a property and being abandoned. Proposed language makes it clear when the pile section Proposed language makes it clear when the pile section is or is not applicable at other types of solid waste facilities. For example, new language states that the pile section is not applicable to piles to be land applied that are subject to WAC 173-350-230, the land application section. Similar language is also proposed for piles at anaerobic digester facilities, composting facilities, and piles stored indoors at recycling, material recovery, or transfer station facilities. The applicability section was structured this way to give clarity when the piles section applies and to avoid the need for multiple solid waste permits at one facility when possible. The current rule provides exemptions for inert waste, wood waste used for fuel or as a raw material, wood-derived fuel, and agricultural waste on farms. These waste types are still afforded exemptions. The proposed rule update adds new exemptions for temporary piles of contaminated soils and dredge materials, non-ferrous metals, brick, cured concrete, or asphaltic materials with a water quality sand and gravel or construction stormwater general permit. In general, to qualify for an exemption under the pile section, an exemption must have the specified material available for an exemption. In other words, if the material is not listed, there is no exemption for it. Have the specified material and meet volume and capacity requirements. Have the specified material for only a temporary basis or specified amount of time. And notify and report based on volume and capacity requirements. With that, I'll go ahead and pass the presentation on to Megan, who will talk about changes to the rule related to moderate risk waste facilities.
All right, thank you, Al. Section 360 of this rule addresses moderate risk waste facilities and activities. Moderate risk waste, referred to as MRW, is both household hazardous waste and waste from businesses that qualify as conditionally exempt small quantity generators. In the definition section of the rule, we added a definition for pharmaceutical take-back programs, and we clarified the definitions for mobile systems and collection events. Other proposed changes relate to exemptions from solid waste permitting. We added a new table showing the conditions that must be met for MRW facilities and activities to be exempt. Pharmaceutical take-back programs were added as a new activity eligible for permit exemption, and the conditions that limited MRW facilities and product take-back centers must meet to qualify for permit exemption were expanded. While there are now more conditions that must be met, they are all common sense measures that most facilities are already practicing. We also proposed updates to facility design requirements. These include clarifying design standards language about facility sign requirements and segregation of incompatible wastes. New language regarding flooring was added, explaining that floors must be impervious only if the floor itself is serving as secondary containment. And while MRW must be protected from wind and precipitation, language was added to explain that the protection may be achieved through design or operational measures. The operating standards section of the rule was divided into two parts. One focusing on how MRW should be managed, as outlined in a plan of operation, and the other focusing on annual reporting requirements. For operating standards, we added a new requirement that trained staff must be present to accept MRW from customers. This doesn't mean that staff must be standing by the MRW receiving area at all times the facility is open. Only that trained staff must be present when customers wish to dispose of MRW. For example, if an MRW facility is co-located with a transfer station, a trained transfer station attendant could go over to the MRW facility when customers are present. Other minor changes in the operating section include stating that staff training requirements be included in the plan of operation, that shipments of MRW out of state can be documented on a shipping paper rather than a uniform hazardous waste manifest, and specifying that ecology and the jurisdictional health department be notified of spills or discharges within 24 hours of the incident. For the annual reporting section, we added clarifying language but did not make any substantial changes. And that concludes our presentation section of this hearing. I'll hand it over to Angie to begin our questions and answer period.
Thank you, Megan. So we know that there are a lot of changes to this rule, and we wanted to make sure that everybody knew that as part of the rule, ecology is required to put together an implementation plan, and what that will do is help solid waste handling facilities come up to speed on the changes to the rule, as well as local health jurisdictions. All right, so we will now start the part of our event where you get to ask the questions and we do our best to answer them. I wanted to make sure that everybody understood that there's a difference between the question and answer session and the hearing portion. Right now you can ask your questions, we can answer them. After the question and answer session, when we take our break, and the hearing begins, you can ask the questions, you can ask the same questions, you can ask new questions, but those will be on the formal record as a comment, and staff will not be able to answer the questions at that time. Rather, they will answer the questions in basically a response to comments. It's called a concise explanatory statement, otherwise known as a CES, when the rule is finalized. For those of us joining on the webinar, we will use the raise hand feature rather than the chat feature. The chat feature is only for technical difficulties. We will use the raise hand feature to let us know that you want to ask a question. If everybody on the webinar could please go ahead and raise your hand right now so we can see that this is a working thing for you.
Kim Harless is raised.
You raised hands? Okay, it looks like we have a few raised hands. Now we're going to do the next part of the practice. We're going to click on that hand again to lower it. That's an important part of the process as well. If we see that you haven't lowered your hand, we may remind you that that needs to be done. Once we answer your question, lower your hand. If you have another question, then raise it again. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead. We're going to kind of rotate between the two offices where people are attending in person and on the webinar. So I'm going to start out here at Headquarters Southwest Regional Office. Is there anyone who has a question? If they do, please come on up and talk on the mic. Yeah, that way everyone on the webinar can hear you. All right, we have one question.
So my name is Jeff Rudolph, Pierce County Public Works, and my question has to do with the solid waste. When you have materials, it says when it moves it, does that put it into solid waste? My question would be on like a slide material, moving slide debris. If you had a flood, do you remove material off the road? Since we would move it back to our pit site, screen it, and then reuse it, does that make it now a solid waste?
That sounds like a question for Dawn Marie. So we'll make sure that you're unmuted. You make sure you're unmuted on your end, Dawn Marie.
I believe I am. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you.
Okay. So the determination of solid waste does not say if you move any material that it becomes a solid waste. It does say specifically that if you have a garbage hauler that comes and picks up material, that's one of the many ways that you can automatically become a solid waste, either a garbage hauler picking up municipal solid waste or picking up recyclable materials. So that moving is only specific to those kinds of actions.
So landslide, removing, excess soil from a ditch, things like that, then would not be solid waste then?
No, the act of removing them does not automatically pull them into solid waste. So what I would say with any material is work through the determination of solid waste, see if it meets any of the criteria to become a solid waste in the first place. And then we have a second section, which is criteria for when a material that became a solid waste can then no longer be a solid waste. So I can't tell you if your material would be a solid waste without running through all of those points in the criteria.
Okay. Well, maybe if we have time later, we can run through those then. Okay. Thank you.
Okay, so I'm going to go on over to the webinar and see if we have anyone with raised hand.
We have Fran Erickson.
Fran Erickson, have we unmuted her? All right, Fran, you're unmuted on our end. Make sure we're unmuted on yours and go ahead and ask your question.
Hello, this is Fran. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Excellent. My question has to do with hog fuel. This is definitely a material managed as a valuable product. It has a positive market value. It is something used in a boiler to produce electricity. This is a product. Is it in any shape or form regulated by this new solid waste rule?
All right, we're going to have Chuck Matthews answer that question.
The short answer to that is no, as long as it's being managed as a commodity. It's treated that way. If it's abandoned, that could change that, but in terms of just the course of normal commerce and supplying fuel to boilers, no, it would not be solid waste.
All right, Fran, did that answer your question?
It sure did. Thank you.
All right, go ahead and mute yourself, and we'll make sure you're muted as well. Okay, we're going to go to the Northwest Regional Office. Is there anyone at Northwest who has a question? Hold on, we need to unmute you. Okay, you're unmuted. Go ahead.
We have a question, and they're just coming right up to ask.
Do routine vehicle operations constitute a release for determination of contaminated soil?
All right, that's a question for Marnie. Is Marnie unmuted?
Yes.
Okay, Marnie, go ahead.
Okay, so street waste is something we consider to be a soil containing contaminants from a release, because you can expect, cars who drip oil and antifreeze and all kinds of things to end up in the street waste that's picked up off of those areas. So yes, that is something we would consider a soil that requires evaluation to figure out the appropriate place for its use.
Yep, there's a follow-up.
So street waste, that would include ditching, ponds, culvert cleanouts, catch basin cleanouts, street sweepings. Would it include road shoulder materials?
Yes, it would.
It would include all those things.
It would, yeah. We have a definition for street waste and what's included in that. And if I can go back to the first person who had a question about things like mudslides.
Okay, go ahead, Marnie.
I believe that was a question really geared towards contaminated soils because that's what it sounded like in terms of dirt movement. So if the material that you are trying to remove or clean off a road based on, some kind of natural disaster, if you think it's impacted from some kind of release of contaminant, then you would need to figure out what you need to do to evaluate it under the rule to figure out the appropriate placement for it. But if you don't think there's impacts from a release of any kind, then the rule doesn't apply. It's considered clean soil as we've defined that in the rule.
And I will add the clarification there that is when the slide is theoretically composed only of soil materials as opposed to buildings or other materials that could have been caught in the slide.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you, Dawn Marie and Marnie. Is there anyone here at Headquarters Southwest who has another question? Yes, we do. Come on up.
Ryan with Miles Resources. So with the change of rules, there's a large recategorization of what was formerly not waste into waste, or what has to be a regulated recycling operation. How is the Department of Ecology managing the requirement to reduce waste and increase recycling by increasing overhead, it seems like? So just what's the metric Ecology is using to monitor if recycling is increased and waste is reducing?
Okay, Kyle, can you help me out? Who would be the best person to put that one to?
Honestly? Oh,
Come over here. Kyle is coming up to the microphone right now.
Okay. Let me restate the question as I understand it. You're asking more about an accountability question about statewide recycling.
RCW that empowers this WAC dictates that waste reduction is the #1 priority, recycling is the #2. How is Ecology monitoring to make sure that waste reduction is occurring and recycling is occurring?
Okay, so we collect data every year on solid waste disposal and recycling activities from annual reports that are submitted as part of the program. We evaluate that data, summarize it, and produce a report each year on what has occurred so we can see whether, in our view, recycling is increasing or decreasing or solid waste disposal is increasing or decreasing. So that's how we accomplish that. The exact implication of the change in the rule for what happens there, that's what I can't answer for you today, but we do an annual report, a roll-up of the reports we get.
All right, did that answer the question, sort of? Okay, you can follow up on it as well. Okay, let's check in on the webinar again. Do we have anyone else who'd like to ask a question? Pam Jenkins, we're going to unmute you on our end. Make sure you're unmuted and go ahead and ask your question.
Okay, thank you. Can you hear me?
Yes. You're very light, but yes, we can hear you.
All right, I'll speak up. Let's imagine an old solid waste landfill that has construction debris in it and miscellaneous non-putrescible waste. The fill, presumably, that was used to cover that waste when this landfill was in action was presumably clean. It had never been used before. If a person wanted to reuse that fill soil, what sort of standards would have to be met, and what would the sampling regime look like?
Okay, I see a movement for that to move over to Marnie to answer.
All right. So let me, Pam, if I can reiterate your question. You're talking about there was a cap placed on an old, like, construction demolition landfill. It was a cap made of soil, presumably clean soil at a time, and there's some reason to remove that soil and use it elsewhere. Is that correct?
That's close, but not quite. This is actually...
If there's no reason to think that that soil had ever been impacted by release of a contaminant, you can manage that as clean soil, and the rule will not apply to that. If there's reason to suspect that it's been impacted in some way, then yes, you need to evaluate it based on what you think it was impacted by, so whatever contaminants you think it might have encountered, and then what you would do is go reference the state cleanup standards to figure out, okay, does it meet it for a residential area, if that's where you want to place it? If you're placing it in a commercial area, it can potentially have higher contaminant limits associated with that use. That's how the rule is going to work at this point.
Okay, Pam, did that get to your question?
It's not clear to me when I say sampling regime, is there any sort of specification? I understand, okay, let's say it was going to be used in a residential area, so the soil would need to meet MOSCA method A. But how much sampling would be required per specified volume of material? In other words, a sample per 500 cubic yards or one sample per 1,000 cubic yards. Is there some direction about that?
Okay, thank you for unmuting me. Yeah, we actually had originally proposed language in earlier versions of the rule that talked a lot more about representative sampling, but we decided based on public comments, the first two informal public comment periods, to revise the way we were approaching soils. And we removed language regarding sampling, but the expectation would be you sample it in accordance with representative sampling techniques, and there is a wide variety of ways to do that depending on the consistency of your materials, whether there's hot spots that might require more sampling than others, how much volume you have in terms of the project site. So there's a lot of ways to figure that out. And we're happy to help, at the health department level or ecology level, help you figure that out. But there is no set standard, no, just like there's not now for representative sampling. It just depends on the type of materials you're looking at.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, thank you, Marnie. Is there anyone at Northwest Regional Office who has another question?
We have at least one, possibly two. Did you want to take both of them? One is a follow-up from earlier.
Yes, let's go ahead.
Okay, come on up, both of you.
So my understanding from the response to the previous question was that routine vehicle operations would be considered a release under the first part of the definition of contaminated soil. I was wondering if you can provide me an example of what a de minimis release might be, because it seems like most anything would constitute a release. So where de minimis would come in that viewpoint.
Okay, Marnie.
Okay, so we do have a definition for de minimis, and we have that primarily initially to define what would be a soil or not a soil based on other things in a material like wood waste or concrete. We may need to adjust it, but the idea behind de minimis is that it doesn't affect the quality, look, use, or impact of a material. And because street waste is known to have contaminants in them, and people who manage street waste right now are regulated as solid waste handling facilities, or should be, if they're treating it for either reuse purposes or even to get contaminant limits down so it can be okay to go into a landfill of some kind. So it's not necessarily a change in how street waste is managed now. It's a clarification that it is captured by the rule.
Yeah, we've got a follow-up to the follow-up.
So it sounds to me like traffic volume or the amount of vehicle operations could come into consideration in the terms of whether a release has occurred. Is that true?
I suppose that's something you could discuss. I can't imagine how much that would impact the soils you're handling. I mean, stormwater catch basins are meant in large part to help filter contaminants from heading into stormwater or surface water. So they are a place where contaminants do accumulate. Yeah, you could handle. The idea behind this rule, just like now, is you have to use your best judgment on whether those materials are safe to be placed in another location. And if you are found to violate the new standards, which would be, exceedance of the cleanup standards where at the location you're putting those materials, then that might get you into enforcement troubles.
And I do want to clarify that we again, in case you missed it at the beginning, that we are going to have rollout training. So we are hoping that the questions that you're asking are more focused on, whether you need to make comments on the draft rule, because we do intend to have very in-depth training to help people understand how to implement the rule whenever we have a final rule that goes into effect.
Thank you, Dawn Marie and Marnie. Okay, Northwest, let's go ahead and move to the other person you had a question from.
Sure. So my question is around Section 21 and the determination of solid waste, or more specifically, Part 3, the determination when something is no longer a solid waste. And I'm wondering how that determination is to be made, how it's documented, sort of who shoulders the burden of proof around making the determination. Is the handler making that determination, and ecology, can question that, or is it ecology that's making the determination? Where does the kind of burden of proof and responsibility for demonstrating that those criteria are met, where does that fall? And then how is ecology, I know there was some discussion in the presentations around wanting consistency across jurisdictions. So in that determination process, how is ecology envisioning consistency in those determinations?
All right,
yeah,
Dawn Marie.
I'm happy to take that since I'm here. So the determination of solid waste is meant to be a tool that can be used by all stakeholders. So someone can start with, hey, do I have a solid waste, or has my material that started as a solid waste moved out of the solid waste realm? So we're not envisioning that this is a formal process in most scenarios. However, Section 4 does clarify that if there is any kind of question as to whether or not the material is a solid waste or is no longer a solid waste, it's the generator or person in possession of that material at the time that bears the burden of proof for demonstrating. But realistically, we don't actually, we're not looking for some, again, formal process or documentation. This is really only going to come up when someone has, a big pile of something, and they say, no, that's my recycled, wonderful material over there, and perhaps the health department has concerns that that material is having an impact, that material is having a release, that material is degrading, and, that being handled in that way, it is losing all its value, or there's a question that that was ever a material that anyone was ever going to buy, ever, but they said, no, we shred used latex gloves, and everyone was going to buy these someday, real soon, we promise. So it's scenarios like that we envision the determination of solid waste tool coming into play when someone needs to demonstrate that they do in fact have something legitimately that's no longer or has never been a solid waste.
All right, thank you, Dawn Marie. We are going to take another question from the Headquarters Southwest Regional Office, if we have any. We have one more. Since you've gone already, I'm going to let someone on the webinar who has not asked a question yet, Stacy Fox, we are unmuting you. Make sure you are unmuted so that we can hear you.
Can you hear me?
Yes, we can. Go ahead.
Okay, great. So my question is related to management of contaminated soil and piles, and it's related to management at a generator facility, not at a receiving facility. And I'm just wondering how the regulations affect facilities that are generating the material versus that have the complete intention of sending it to a Subtitle D landfill, understanding that it's contaminated above MOTCA, but how does the management at their site, how are the new regulations affected for them?
Marnie, do you want to go ahead and take that one?
I can take this one, although it should go to Al Salvi, but I don't, for the pile storage section, just like the rule has now, there is a 90-day temporary storage allowance before any kind of permitting would kick in, and that's meant for places like the generating site or contaminated soils are going to some kind of a transfer facility prior to final disposal or use. So you have 90 days before rule requirements would kick in or any permitting. So under the rule, the proposed rule now, we offer a permit exemption for 90-day temporary storage. And you might want to click Al on so he can say anything he needs to.
Al, do you want to add anything?
That's about right.
Al says that's about right. Thank you, Marnie. All right, Stacy, is there anything, did that answer your question?
It did. I actually have one more question kind of related is, so the idea of excavation and reuse on site, what's the definition of on site? Is it a parcel? Is it within a project? There's large facilities that take up acres and acres of property that may be reusing material on site. How would that be affected, and what would be the definition of on site reuse?
Yeah, we had questions on this in previous informal comment periods, and I have tried to describe it as best as I possibly can, acknowledging that obviously a speck of soil will not go back in the exact same location as it was removed from. So the idea behind this is for things like, you're putting in a new water line and you remove those soils to put in said water line, but you place those soils right back where they were, close enough to where they were located originally that it's not going to have a new impact. Likewise for things like engineered soils where you're, digging some kind of a tunnel and you're planning to put those soils back. It's not going back to the exact same location, but it's not going somewhere new where it's going to have some new impacts. That's the idea. If you think if there's a need to provide more clarity in how we describe that particular exclusion from the rule, please do comment on that. Or if you have ideas for language to improve it, because it is hard to describe within a project site, but we do mean, placement back as near as possible to where it was originally excavated from. Not miles away if it's a project that size, for example.
Okay. Thank you, Marnie. We're going to take a question from Headquarters Southwest. Come on up.
This is Ryan with Miles Resources. I was just wanting some clarification why there was a specific exemption for asphalt shingles in the asphaltic material definition.
Al's going to go ahead and take that one.
Why there is an exemption for asphalt shingles?
Yeah, why is it exempt out of the exemption?
Why it does not include asphaltic roofing shingles?
Yes.
Okay. That is just a material that it's one of those materials that people have had some good ideas about recycling, and we've just never seen any markets really develop for that material yet. There's a few going on where it's kind of some situations where it's going back into like a hot mix, things like that. That's something that can be worked with. But a lot of and in those situations there's a good arrangement set up for those, but most of the situations weren't in that type of arrangement with a facility like that. So those were decided not to be included because there are some, we just haven't seen the markets develop for those. looks like Chuck wants to add something here.
So Chuck Matthews is going to join in on the conversation.
I think what's important also to understand is that when you're looking at asphalt in the context of it being in the inert waste category, you're typically and historically been looking at monolithic forms of that asphalt. So it comes in, it's in a big, pretty much bound up matrix. As it's ground and reintroduced, that kind of gets it into a recycled product realm. We have had a number of occasions, and you don't get the same thing with the asphalt roofing shingles, and we have had a lot of problems where they've been accumulated. I think a paving company has a ready-made market for it. We've had this, though, be accumulated in a number of spots around the state where brought in, processed, tip fee charged, and nothing was able to be done with it. So as a recycler, if you're bringing that in and you're actually incorporating it into that matrix, then you've recycled it. So a little bit of distinction between the...
Would there be potential to include an exemption if there is an end use, like a very closed loop end use for shingles?
The question is there potential for an exemption if there is a closed loop use for these asphaltic shingles?
I think as a recycler, that's already there. Just from the standpoint of if you're actually moving the product, and we talked about the 90-day stuff, and Al, if I'm misstating here, please correct me, but you know, if it's coming in and being accumulated or at a rate that isn't being just stockpiled, I think as a recycler you already have some regulatory relief from that.
But based on the language you guys talked about earlier, it has to be if we have to build up a pile and use it completely, build up a pile, use it completely. Am I correct? So if we have a continuous pile, then we wouldn't have the exemption.
Hold on, Don Marie.
That is correct. On a continuous pile that is not listed, you know, the waste listed specifically in the piles exemption section, yes, that would require a permit.
So there is no language for an exemption at this point. Okay.
Don Marie, did you want to join in the conversation?
I did. I wanted to point out that this is not a change. We previously had this criteria under 990, the criteria for inert waste, and we moved those into the definition section. So excluding asphaltic roofing shingles from asphaltic materials is not a change. It was in the current rule.
I guess my one question to that is if it is asphalt shingles, talking 3-tab shingles, what's the compositional difference between that and recycled asphalt pavement?
That I'd have to look. I couldn't answer that right now.
They are chemically quite different.
Yeah, I mean, yeah, that's what
I think that we will maybe carry on this conversation outside of the event today. Sounds like that's a chemistry question. We have Fran Erickson on the webinar. Fran, do you have another question?
I do. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, great. My next question is regarding sewage sludge. There seems to be a change in the definition. Primarily, my question is associated with wastewater treatment, primary and secondary clarifier sludges, as well as sanitary sewer treatment sludges in the biosolids arena. Could someone describe the changes to sewage sludge in the new rule, if there is any?
Okay, Kyle is coming up to answer that question.
So this may be one of those things that's a surprise to me. I'm not aware that we've changed the definition of sewage sludge in the rule at all. Sewage sludge is derived from the treatment of wastewater or under the solid waste rules, and biosolids is a category of sewage sludge that's gone through a treatment process that makes it appropriate for beneficial uses, and it's regulated under a totally separate rule. Can you specifically tell me what changed and what you see as a change? That would help me answer your question better, but otherwise I'm not aware that we would change anything.
Sure. It might be an editorial issue on the version of the changes that I got, but under sewage sludge, it looks like we've added this language, during preliminary treatment of domestic sewage in a treatment works, to the end of the definition.
Yeah, that without looking at the definition, without looking at the definition, and I'm not looking at it right now, I can't answer your question, but that particular language is familiar to me as something that's always been there. What I would recommend is just ask your question, submit your question as a comment, and then we'll address it. And I also will take a look at it independently to see if something snuck in there, but there wasn't any intent here in our rulemaking to make a change. Megan, we have somebody who's trying to give me some input right now, so hang on a second, Megan.
I think it was a typo in the current rule that line was missing, and we looked it up because it comes from another statute.
Okay, there might have been Megan Warfield just let me know there might have been a typographical error in the current rule, and then that was picked up in the current rule writing.
The current rule language, the last sentence of the definition says, sewage sludge does not include ash generated during the firing of sewage sludge in a sewage sludge incinerator or grit and screenings generated. So in the current rule, the end of that sentence has always been missing. So this was a definition that obviously came from another RCW. I don't have it off the top of my head right now. So that last part of the definition, generated during preliminary treatment of a domestic sewage in a treatment works, was added to complete the sentence.
And there's your answer, and I can tell you the language in question comes from federal rules, and we've simply copied it down to the state level. So that apparently was a benefit of this extensive rule revision process, is that we found errors to correct, I guess.
Okay, so that's great. So there's no change as far as our burning for energy recovery, these types of materials. Thank you so much.
Kyle would like to say something more.
Okay.
Well, I think that's the first part I heard about how there's no change as far as burning the materials for energy recovery. Everything was focused on the definition. Incineration of sewage sludge is regulated under federal and state laws and rules, and is still subject to state laws and rules. And the application of those state laws and rules hasn't changed that I'm aware of, and neither would this rulemaking have changed that. But it doesn't. The rulemaking doesn't open the door to incinerating sewage sludge without addressing the requirements of other applicable rules and regulations.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Fran. We're going to check in with Northwest Regional Office again and see if there's anyone. We are unmuting you right now. Anybody else at Northwest have any questions?
We do have a question coming up.
Hi, this is Troy Lautenbach. I'm referring to a couple of the issues that were brought up regarding to when a solid waste becomes a non-solid waste in 350.021.3C specifically. With the recycling markets the way they are, and as a recycler, I'm very concerned about the fact that as soon as you pay somebody to take your commodity, now it's a solid waste, and that person taking your commodity has to get a solid waste handling permit. So the paper mill that takes the hog fuel in, with what King County has done with SPU as well, banning wood from landfills, now you create this economic scenario where there's a lot more wood in the marketplace, and such the mill can now potentially charge for that material. Or let's say the bale of cardboard is in such a place where that bale of cardboard is still the same bale of cardboard, but now the mill has an economic place. And I respect what you said, Don Marie, about the fact that we got to take care of these piles and all of those things. I thoroughly do. But my concern is as soon as you have to pay, as a recycler, you pay somebody to take this material that you've gleaned and you've packaged in a nice commodity form. As soon as you pay, they now need to get a solid waste handling permit, and subsequently they might be in a manufacturing zone, light industrial zone, and there's no way that they can be compliant with their zoning by getting a solid waste handling permit. I have some concerns over that.
Well, I'm happy to speak to that. So actually, under the current rule, those materials are still recyclable solid waste. So your bale of cardboard, or whatnot, and most of those facilities are regulated as exempt recyclers, those end users. So right now, we have facilities like Nucor and some of the big mills that are taking in paper or cardboard. Those are all under the rule right now. They don't have to get a solid waste handling permit. They meet all of the criteria for exemption. They send in an annual report every year. So we are going to lose a bunch of those facilities that are currently considered recycling facilities that will now no longer be solid waste handling facilities. As far as regulations involving the port, those are a little bit different, and right now we have tons of material that, well, hundreds of thousands and thousands of tons of material that are passing out of our state and out of our jurisdiction. So this actually, the rule is going to let a lot more materials out, not capture more materials. And as far as that whole question about positive market value, we did get a lot of comments about that. And the reality is that when you have something that has negative value, that is historically when we have seen problems with speculative accumulation and poor management. We've seen scenarios where someone said, I know the market's going to get better, so I'm going to fill this warehouse and then my yard and then the adjacent yard with this material that I just know tomorrow everyone's going to buy tire bales. I just know tomorrow that everyone is going to buy whatever that material is. We've had big cleanups with stockpiles of ground asphaltic roofing shingles and unground asphaltic roofing shingles, where, again, there were claims made that, no, that the market's going to be really good, and the fact that this has filled the entire space and is running off and having discharge issues. But seriously, it's not a waste, because someday someone's going to want to buy it. So we're not saying that that material can't ever have a value. We're not saying that that material can't be moved. We're just saying that that material may still be a recyclable solid waste subject to the regulations. Your operation may qualify for an exemption, or you may need to just change some operation practices to make sure that runoff is being managed or you're not attracting vectors. So we're definitely not saying that that material isn't going to ultimately go to an end user. We're just saying that in the interim, that is still a possibly recyclable solid waste that has to be managed under the rule.
Talking about two different things.
I'm sorry. I thought I missed it.
I completely agree with everything you said. Absolutely. But I'm talking about the people that are a manufacturing plant that, because of economic conditions, can take in a failed product of some sort and remanufacture that. As we're trying to push recycling markets, we're trying very hard in a very difficult time. And per this language, that manufacturer has to get a solid waste handling permit or an exempt status, which means they need to be in compliance with zoning laws.
Currently those end users are under the solid waste handling regulations, and we have lots of examples of those reporting and notifying. So some of the examples of those big ones, like mills right now, are already exempt recyclers under the rule. And I definitely encourage you, to make a comment, a formal comment on the rule. We encourage all of you, if you have concerns or questions, to make a formal comment on the rule, and that will be part of the concise explanatory statement.
Thank you, Dawn Marie. Okay, I'm going to check in really quick with Headquarters Southwest Region Office. Are there any other questions? Yes, we have one. Come on up.
Hi, this is Rod Whitaker, Associate Counsel, Washington Refuse and Recycling Association. I had a question about the presentation on the determination of waste test. The presentation slide says that one of the factors is that a material is a solid waste if it is sent to a regulated solid waste disposal or recycling facility. I don't know if the rule language makes the distinction between regulated, so I'm curious what that means. Does that include both permitted and permit-exempt facilities?
Dawn Marie?
Yes, if the facility is already either a permit or a permit-exempt recycling, material recovery, pile, transfer station, something like that, and the material is going to a facility that is already regulated in that way, then yes, the material may be potentially a recyclable solid waste, but it is still regulated as a solid waste.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, we have a new person on the webinar. Lori, you lowered your hand, so we're going to unmute you really quick and make sure if you don't answer, that's okay.
No, I'll just include my comments in a letter. We've already actually submitted comments. It has to go with the positive market value, and I'm sort of in disagreement with some of the statements that were made. If you are actually sending material in the process and you're trying to develop a new market and you're actually sending it to a place that's getting recycled, but because it's brand new and you might have to supplement and support that development of the new product. So it isn't like material is just sitting around waiting to find a new home as a recycler. You've actually found it, but in order to develop a product, you always have to go through that cycle of developing a new product, and you might have to support it in some way. And so it depends upon how you define positive market value. And if you tie it to the fact that you have to pay someone to take it off your property, that could easily dissuade any new recycling ideas or concepts. And so I appreciate that you don't want stuff just piling up everywhere. I totally get that. But at the same time, you want to be able to enable markets. You want to be able to enable innovation. And I think the way the definition is written right now, it's just not going to do that. And so we've already put our comments in writing a couple of times. We're happy to do it again.
Okay, thank you, Lori. Fran, you still have your hand up. Do you have another question?
Sorry about that. I did not. I'll take it down.
Okay, thank you. Northwest Regional Office, do you have anyone else who has questions there?
Hang on just a sec while they come up.
Hi. So under Section 173.340.700 of the Model Toxic Control Act, all methods for establishing cleanup levels under MOTCA require a terrestrial ecological evaluation for contaminated soils. Therefore, it's unclear what standard is applied in Part A of the definition without an a priori determination that a soil is or is not contaminated. Could you please clarify what process you would go by to determine the cleanup level that you would use to determine whether or not a soil was clean or contaminated? Thank you.
Marnie, that one's over to you.
Yeah, so, MOTCA is not as simple as a lot of people would like to hope that it is. And if you have a site that, undertaking a cleanup action would require terrestrial ecological evaluation, then you would have to go through that process for this as well. And if it was determined that you needed to meet the ecological standards for safety, if you wanted to move your soils to that particular spot, you would have to account for those contaminant concentrations that are associated with that. There is no one set MOTCA standard. It is all based on the parameters of the site you want to place your soils.
We've got a follow-up.
But if we're trying to get a standard by which we're determining whether or not a soil is clean or contaminated, and I guess what you're saying is that we would have to know the end disposal site at the time the soil is excavated, and also that site would determine how clean, because the crux I'm getting at here is that if you don't know whether or not your soil is clean versus contaminated, and the standard you're going to use to determine that also says if you're contaminated soil, you have a higher standard. Like, there's no way you could figure out what standard to use to determine whether or not your soil is clean or contaminated. Does that make sense? Or should
No, yeah, and this is a different way of managing a material because it is based on the type of use. So it's kind of similar, I guess, in my mind to, we have exclusions for the agronomic land application for manure. And if used in an agronomic manner, manure management in that way is not considered solid waste handling. However, if you overapply or you're using it as fill, then all of a sudden the rule does kick in. And so this is a similar scenario to that. If you're placing contaminated soils in a way that is safe in the environment you're placing them in consideration of, the ecological impacts, if you have, a groundwater supply underneath you need to concern yourself with, the types of human interaction with that site, then you fall out, then we're not going to capture you under the rule. But if you are placing contaminants at that place and they're in violation of a standard that is considered safe for that, then yes, you should apply for, limited purpose landfilling standards or just shouldn't place it there to begin with. So yeah, there is an expectation that you know where you're putting this material.
So how would a material recycler be able to accept fill material if they don't know who's going to buy it at some point to use as fill?
If it's a contaminated material, they probably shouldn't be taking it to begin with unless they have evaluated their site specifically and consulted with somebody to ensure it's okay for them to take it.
But you don't know whether or not it's contaminated or not because you don't know what the inside is.
Well, if you know that your material has been impacted by a release, then you should be looking at that to make sure you're not putting it somewhere that's harmful. And that's currently how the rule is meant to work, and the idea is not to create a cleanup site and put people or the environment at risk.
So the standards create a cleanup site as hazardous substance. The cleanup level, so I think maybe I'm not explaining my question clearly enough. In terms of how do you determine when a soil is clean or contaminated, because you're right, MOTCA isn't clear about what that standard is going to be. So how would you know that unless you make an a priori sort of determination if your soil is clean or contaminated?
So we have a definition for contaminated soil that is tied to release of a contaminant to those soils. And if you have had a release of contaminant to those soils, the expectation is you look at those soils to figure out what contaminant limits there are. And if you want to use those soils at a different location, then you have to make sure you're not creating a cleanup site at that location. And that will be based on the specific standards of that location. I'm not sure I'm answering your question correctly, but our definition of release is tied to our definition of contaminant, which does differ from MOTCA, because we have different statutes that we abide by.
I think I will just make that a comment.
Okay, we're good. Appreciate it.
Okay, thank you. I'm going to check in with Headquarters Southwest Region, see if there's anyone else who has a question here. Seeing none, do we have any on the webinar? Any hands? Nobody? Northwest Region, do you have anyone else?
It does not appear that we have any other questions at this time, nope.
Okay, we do have one more from Headquarters Southwest, so come on up.
My question has to do with street sweepings. So if we were to go out and get, let's say, 50 cubic yard, 100 cubic yard pile of street sweepings, we were to screen that and then we were to test it, per the new rules and regulations, and the testing came back below MOTCA levels, would that be considered a clean soil then, or what would we consider that?
That is what is soil under the rule, yep.
Great, thank you.
And therefore, it's not solid waste handling.
Okay, I'm not seeing any more questions at this time. So we're going to take a 5-minute break while we set up for the hearing. The hearing portion is where you sit down with me and a recorder, and we record your comments for the formal record on this rule to be answered in the concise explanatory statement. No one in the room will be able to answer your questions, so this is your last chance to ask And
we do have another question
go
from
ahead.
Northwest.
Go ahead.
Yeah, I have a question concerning the requirements for the engineering documentation. Pretty much having an engineer of record watch for the construction or monitor the construction, and then file a report finally once construction is completed. It seems like that requirement is required about on any solid waste handling facility, whether it's basic labs and buildings versus, something more sophisticated like a transfer station or a landfill itself. And I'm curious about some potentials for limitations or at least modifications to that, if that's correct, that it is required across the board, if local health jurisdictions can relax some of that engineering requirement, particularly when elements of a facility may require a construction permit by the local building officials, where they are reviewing the documentation to see that the building is designed appropriately and then it's built to that standard. What would be the purpose for having engineering stamps to trail along with that particular type of requirement? And there again, I'm looking at it as being a potential impedance to encourage startup recycling facilities to get going, get their feet under them to actually advance recycling, more so than I would be, let's say, a landfill, where obviously there's long-term merit associated with that. So that's
Okay, Bill Harris is going to answer that question for us.
Hi. Yeah, the origins of that really did come from principally the landfill sections and the surface impoundments and tank sections. But there was a recognition, I think, and what the intent there with the origins of that was really to kind of collect the existing requirements from the permitting requirements sections towards the end of the existing rule, and also to address for each different type of solid waste handling activity that the rule may address in the individual sections, any specific requirements for those particular types of activities. So we kind of spread it throughout the rule for consistency purposes. There has been some discussion, there is recognition that there might be some degree to which you want to scope what the actual products, the deliverables that would address those requirements would look like based on the type of facility, so that we don't have people to sort of having the ability to build whatever kind of structure they want and then come in and ask for a permit on it. I would agree that there is some overlap potentially with local building codes, and that I think it's at the health department's discretion as they're looking at permit application review or permit modification review, that they can make a determination for a particular type of facility, really how rigorous that process needs to be, sort of relative to what the proposal that the applicant is coming in with.
All right, did that answer the question?
So am I hearing you correctly that the local health departments can make the call, that engineering would not be a requirement for this element or this element of a facility, and may be required for element C, and it would be up to them to be able to make that call?
I believe that would probably be up to the health department's discretion, yes.
I don't see that in the way the rule is written. So that's what my question is, whether or not ecology and interpreting the rule would have the latitude to not respond back to the local health authority and say, but the rule says.
Well, my advice would be to comment to that effect, and we will try and address that through the concise explanatory statement, see if we need to adjust anything in the language.
Okay, thank you. Do you have anyone else over there at Northwest?
Does not appear so.
Okay, we're going to go ahead and take a 5-minute break, so we'll come back at 10:23 to start the hearing. Thank you. Okay, we will now begin the formal hearing section of this event, which we will record for the public record. Please make sure that in the Northwest Regional Office and here at Headquarters Southwest Regional Office, cell phones are muted or in airplane mode so that we can get a clear recording. Also, if you are joining us on webinar and you want to make a formal comment, please raise your hand at this time. We're going to start at Headquarters Southwest, then we will move to Northwest Regional Office, and then we will move to webinar to take formal comments. Okay. I'm Angela Fritz, hearings officer for this action. Today we are conducting a hearing on the rule proposal for Chapter 173-350 Washington Administrative Code, the Solid Waste Handling Standards. Let the record show it is 10:26 a.m. on March 6, 2018, and this hearing is being held by webinar at the Department of Ecology's headquarters and Southwest Regional Office, 300 Desmond Drive Southeast in Lacey, Washington, 98503, and at the Department of Ecology's Northwest Regional Office, 160th Avenue Southeast in Bellevue, Washington, 98008. Legal notice of this hearing was published in the Washington State Register on February 7th, 2018, under Washington State Register number 18-03-065. In addition, notices of the hearing were sent to about 800 interested people on Ecology's Waste to Resources Program Solid Waste Handling Standards listserv, 1,083 people on Ecology's WAC Track listserv, and a news release was issued on January 25th, 2018. I will call on people to provide testimony by rotating between those at the in-person locations who have indicated they would like to provide comment and webinar participants who have raised their hand. Once everyone who has indicated they would like to testify has had the opportunity, I will ask again if anyone else wishes to testify. When providing comment, please make sure you are close to a microphone so that we can all hear you and also get a clear record of your comment. State your name, and if you haven't already given us your contact information, either an address or an email, please do so. You can also provide this to me after the hearing. Speak clearly so we can get a good recording of your testimony. We will begin with Rod Whitaker.
My name is Rod Whitaker, Associate Counsel for the Washington Refuse and Recycling Association. WRA represents the private sector solid waste service providers who provide essential environmental services every day in virtually every community in the state. WRA will submit written comments in detail, but on behalf of Executive Director Lovis and our membership, I want to take the opportunity to highlight two key issues that the final rule should address. First, I want to talk about the determination of waste tests. The test, if successfully implemented, should make a useful tool for both the regulators and the industry. Elements of the test that incorporate positive market value and markets are crucial, and we strongly support their inclusion. However, the latest version of the test removes a key factor present in all previous versions. The missing factor stated that to no longer be considered a solid waste, a material must be separated from other solid waste. Ultimately, the rule has to support the statute, and recycling in 7095 begins with source separation. The concept of source separation is key to both the act of recycling and the underlying statutory authority here. The legislature finds that source separation of waste must become a fundamental strategy of solid waste management and ranks source separation second in its priorities for the management of solid waste in Washington in 7095-010. We understand that the fact that materials must be separated from other wastes may be inherent in some of the other factors, but the concept of source separation is so crucial to recycling that it should remain in the test. And I also want to briefly comment on the recycling and material recovery facility section. Changes that limit the scope of the permit exemptions in this section are a good first step in addressing longstanding issues with exempt facilities. First, 173, 350, 210-2 states that a facility that does not comply with the terms of its exemption may be subject to permitting requirements. This should be changed to must become permitted or cease operation in order for the rule to have any real effect. We understand that the department first offers technical assistance to bring entities into compliance. However, if they fail to achieve compliance within a reasonable but limited timeline, the rule needs to specify that these facilities must also obtain a permit or close. Second, the exemption table should also reference the transporter law and require compliance as a condition of permit exemption. Overall, we support the changes in this section to limit the scope of the exemption, but without an accurate list of the affected entities or an accurate listing of the existing facilities in Washington even, we're unable to fully support or understand the scope of these changes. And we'll also submit detailed comments that elaborate on the discussion here and other issues. Thanks for the opportunity to comment.
All right, thank you, Rod. We are now going to unmute Northwest Regional Office and see if there's anyone there who would like to provide comment. Go ahead.
Do we have anyone who would like to provide comment? We do have one, yes.
Okay. Please make sure you're sitting in front of a microphone so we can get a clear recording, and make sure to state your name. And if we do not have your contact information, either an address or an email, please make sure to include that.
Hi, this is McKenna Morrigan. I'm with Cascadia Consulting Group here on behalf of the King County Link Up Market Development Initiative. And Link Up is working to advance recycling and support market development for 3-tab asphalt shingles through the use in asphalt paving mix. This is an effort that has been ongoing since for more than a decade, and has included financial funding through DOE's CPG program. So we know that this is an area of great interest for the state. As you may know, asphalt shingles in pavement production not only keeps this recyclable material out of the landfill, it also delivers substantial environmental benefits. Using recycled asphalt shingles in place of virgin petroleum-based asphalt binder and paving mix at the levels authorized by the State Department of Transportation can reduce greenhouse gas emissions impacts of asphalt mix by 7%. And a study by the US EPA in 2013 found that using asphalt shingles reduced the greenhouse gas emissions of asphalt paving mix production by a much more substantial amount than the use of warm mix production technology, which is the other major strategy for reducing emissions associated with asphalt paving mix production. Recycling asphalt shingles into pavement is a win-win. It conserves resources, reduces pollution, and decreases the flow of a valuable material into landfills. The Link Up program is cognizant of the issues that have arisen in the past due to stockpiles of asphalt shingles by misguided or bad actors, but we have also direct experience seeing successful asphalt shingles recycling that can occur when this material is managed as an integrated element of asphalt production by asphalt producers. And that is where we see great potential for increased recycling of asphalt shingles in Washington state. The proposed changes to 173-350 standards have the potential to significantly affect the recycling of 3-tab asphalt shingles in Washington, and we have concerns that they may have a negative effect on asphalt shingles recycling if they have permitting implications for asphalt producers. And so I'm here on behalf of Link Up to seek some clarity about how the proposed changes will apply to the handling and recycling of 3-tab asphalt shingles. We encourage the Department of Ecology to adopt language that protects the land and waters of our beautiful state, while also ensuring that the climate benefits of recycling asphalt shingles can be realized through increased recycling of this, through responsible handling and increased recycling of this material in coming years. I specifically have a question about section 21 and the determination of solid waste. Our interpretation of this section is that 3-tab asphalt shingles possessed by asphalt producers, once ground and ready for use in asphalt mix production, would not be considered a solid waste. so long as the material is stored and managed to preserve its value and stored in a manner that presents little or no risk to human health and the environment. Asphalt producers already operate under sand and gravel permits, so the ground asphalt shingles material on site of these facilities would be subject to these existing permit requirements, which involve stormwater discharge monitoring and management. We assume in our interpretation that operations that meet those sand and gravel requirements would be considered to be in compliance with the requirements of Section 21, Part 3, and we're hoping that ecology can confirm that our interpretation of this section as it pertains to recycled asphalt shingles is correct. And then secondly, in Section 320 for piles used for storage and treatment, Table 320A provides the possibility of exemption from solid waste permits for holders of sand and gravel permits with asphaltic material on site, but does not currently extend the same exemption for asphalt roofing shingles that would be used in asphalt mix production in a similar manner as asphaltic material. Again, because asphalt plants already operate under sand and gravel general permits that set explicit requirements for stormwater discharge monitoring and management, our review of those sand and gravel permits related to stormwater management and dust control, our interpretation of that is that those requirements are equal to or more stringent than the requirements that would be laid out for outdoor piles under the solid waste handling regulations. So our question is, because asphalt plants are already required to be permitted, already subject to local health department oversight, and already responsible for regular monitoring and reporting related to stormwater management, for these permitted facilities that have 3-tab asphalt roofing shingles on site for processing and use in asphalt mix production, we would strongly encourage the Department of Ecology to include an allowance in Table 320 for the sand and gravel general permit to apply to asphalt shingles as well in lieu of a solid waste handling permit in line with the allowance that is made for asphaltic material. And that's it.
Okay, thank you. Is there anyone else at Northwest Regional Office who'd like to provide comment? Okay.
Dave Gent with the Washington Asphalt Pavement Association. I'd just like to state asphalt plants already generally operate under sand and gravel permits that set explicit requirements for stormwater discharge. We understand the concerns related to piles without a current market, but asphalt plants that intend to use recycled asphalt shingles and hot mix asphalt act as a solution to this problem. We point out that the DOE's own publication on acceptable uses of recycled asphalt shingles in Washington State ends with the conclusion that the use as part of hot mix asphalt or cold patch does not need to go through an approval process under state solid waste regulation. And we'd like we would like this conclusion to be realized through specific exemption in category table 320A for recycled asphalt shingles to be used in hot mix asphalt or cold patch. And that's it.
Okay, thank you. Is there anyone else at the Northwest Regional Office who would like to provide comment?
Yes. Troy Lautenbach here. I just want to comment to the asphalt shingles scenario to prove my earlier point, the fact that if I have to process my asphalt shingles and then pay them to utilize them in their asphalt plant, they will need to get a solid waste handling permit per the 021 standards. I would suggest that we re-examine that.
Okay, thank you, Troy. Is there anyone else at Northwest Regional Office who would like to provide comment?
Hi, yes, Natalie Seitz, Snohomish County. I'd like to thank Ecology for the opportunity to comment both today, but also for the initial and the preliminary draft of this rule. Essentially, I would ask for two things. One, that the Department of Ecology provide clarity to the proposed rule and recirculate it for another round of comments prior to adoption. The second thing I would ask is that Ecology include impacts to local governments and business in its cost-benefit analysis right now, I think that it's very limited in its consideration of those impacts. In fact, it says that there are no impacts related to the change in definitions, and it's clear that the contaminated soils definition is a change. I will point out that the Department of Ecology's current guidance in the Stormwater Manual Appendix IVG, Recommendations for Management of Street Waste, does say there are no specific references for reuse and disposal options of street waste in the solid waste handling standards because they do not apply to clean soils. I think that the response to comments today clearly demonstrates that there is a change in the way that these materials will be regulated, and not just street waste, any materials that would be subject to routine vehicle operations if that is the bar by which a release is going to be considered. So there will be significant costs associated with this proposed rule, including permits, staff, time to determine what to do with these materials, structural improvements, testing, record keeping, staff and equipment to manage soils, and the cost of contaminated soils disposal, as well as considerations of what material vendors that currently recycle materials, how they would undertake these regulations related to soils when the end site of a soil is unknown. I will say that both the definition of clean and contaminated soils, so that if it is subject to a release, then there's a SMOT standard under Part A of both clean and contaminated soils. So the end site does need to be known even to determine if it is a clean or contaminated soil under the proposed rule. And that's my interpretation of it. So I thank you for considering those comments. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Is there anyone else at Northwest Regional Office who wishes to provide testimony on this rule?
No, I think we're done.
Okay, thank you. I'm going to check in now and see if there's anyone on the webinar who's raised their hand to provide oral comment. Just a reminder about that, if you're joining us by webinar only and not at one of our in-person locations, you need to use the raise hand feature inside of the webinar to let us know you want to provide comment. Johanna, is there anyone right now who has their hand raised?
No.
No. Okay. I'm going to check one more time with the Southwest Regional Office Headquarters group here. Is there anyone else who'd like to provide comment today on the record? No. Northwest, one more time. Is there anyone else there who would like to provide additional comment?
No, there is not.
Okay. If you would like to send Ecology written comments, please remember they are due by March 20th, 2018. We accept written comments in the following ways: at the hearing, by mail, or by using our online comment form. To get instructions on how to comment by mail or online, please visit our website, or you can contact Kyle Dorsey. All testimony received at this hearing, as well as at other hearings to be held by webinar and in Union Gap and in Spokane on March 9th, along with all written comments received no later than March 20th, will be part of the official hearing record for this proposal. Ecology will send notice about the Concise Explanatory Statement, or CES, publication to everyone that provided written comment or oral testimony on this rule proposal and submitted contact information. Everyone that signed in for today's hearing that provided an email address, and other interested parties on the agency's mailing lists for this rule. The CES will, among other things, contain the agency's response to questions and issues of concern that were submitted during the public comment period. If you would like to receive a copy but did not give us your contact information, please let one of the staff at your hearing location know, or contact Kyle Dorsey at the contact information provided for submitting comments. The next step in this process is to review the comments and make a determination whether to adopt the rule. Ecology Director Maya Bellin will consider the rule documentation and staff recommendations and will make a decision about adopting the proposal. Adoption is currently scheduled for April 25th, 2018. If the proposed rule should be adopted that day and filed with the code revisor, it will go into effect 31 days later. If we can be of further help to you, please do not hesitate to ask, or you can contact Kyle if you have any other questions. On behalf of the Department of Ecology, thank you for coming. I appreciate your cooperation and your courtesy. Let the record show this hearing is adjourned at 10:45 a.m. Okay, that concludes our webinar and our hearing. Thank you, everyone. All right, folks in Northwest and Eastern and Central for joining us, and everyone on the webinar.